let me talk about this stuff regarding the socialist mode of production, because this is one of those things where you're dealing with literally what Lenin just said, which is that you're confusing something that might be true on like a material level for something that's true at the propaganda sense, okay? So maybe, depending on how you look at it, in the propaganda sense, this may not necessarily be true, right? In the propaganda sense, as Lenin put it, it depends on the context of what you're trying to say. But saying that America is already socialist is not a statement that you make devoid of context, okay? So when you're in front of a group of socialist or communist activists, they hear that and they're like, okay, so all of my work is useless then. So everything that I'm fighting for is pointless. They're removing the context of contradiction and irony inherent to the statement and making it seem like this is some unconditional slogan that has like immediate practical implications for your activistic practice. When what it means to say that the US is already socialist within the context of the global triumph of a socialist mode of production, again, it's multiple prongs, so I'm going to explain exactly what it means, okay? One, it means by stating this and speaking this into existence, like just saying it, right? You are pretty much attacking the superstructure. You're delegitimizing the ideological and superstructural way in which the current ruling class legitimizes itself. You're exposing the fact that while they teach us we live in a free market capitalist society, we already have a type of socialism. So that incriminates them. It's inherently something that incriminates them. So that's one of the first things you're doing, is you are attacking the hegemonic ideology that rules within the US. The other thing it does is that when you're talking to ordinary people, they have a lot of fear about what socialism is. Now, this is what's going to bother people like cold empanadas and all these other perverts, but contrary to what you think, most people don't want some mysterious political group or the government to come and fundamentally uproot every aspect of life as they know it. Like, introduce this ideology from scratch out of nowhere and conform reality to it. That's like an extremely dangerous, scary, and shocking thing. A lot of edgy adolescent teenagers and people who are generally unhappy with life, I'm sure, fantasize about that. It's just not something ordinary people want to hear. By the way, I'm not just saying this is like to pander to them. I'm saying this is true, that we already live in socialism. I'm going to explain to you what that means, right? But you're basically explaining to normal people that the burden of us is not to prove that socialism is possible, okay? We don't have to prove to you some new system is possible. It has already triumphed, and it basically already won, okay? So that's the important thing. We don't have to prove to you it's possible because we're already fucking living in it, okay? We don't have to prove this new system. Now, Frog and the others have a very utopian conception of socialism, which they assume is that it's this contrived idea in our heads that we're going to somehow impose on reality or conform reality to. But Marx had something to say about this specific wrong view of socialism. So this is what Marx said. He said, communism is not a state of affairs which is to be established. It's just literally implied in his tweet. We're going to vote in communism. Well, no, that's a wrong way of thinking about what communism is. It's not a state of affairs we're going to establish. It's not an ideal reality will adjust itself to because of us. It's the real movement which, and this is not abolish, it's sublate Aufhebung, the present state of things. And that the conditions of this movement result from premises now in existence, okay? Now, if you read Engels' Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, that movement is not just political in nature. It also has to do with changes in the mode of production itself, which Engels literally describes and refers to as an invading socialist mode of production from the future. It's kind of very Landian, the way Engels describes it. But yeah, Engels describes how the socialist mode of production is already entering into reality through capitalism itself. And they were very clear about that. So that's another important way of understanding it, is that it's not so much that I'm trying to pander people by making it seem less radical or even less edgy. It's more to like explain to people that socialism is not some arbitrary discontinuity with the reality they're already familiar with. It is rather a logical conclusion, and it's something that actually follows rationally from the one that they're used to. There's a rational connection between the normal world as they know it and what we call socialism or a socialist mode of production. So this is another example of what I would call the propaganda aspect of its importance, right? Now, another reason why I think it's very important from a perspective of ideology and consciousness and stuff is that it also eliminates a voluntaristic and utopian conception of socialism that most socialists have, which has a lot to do with the Hegelian unhappy consciousness, which is basically that I think that this world is morally wrong and morally unjust, and I have an idea of a better world in my head, and I just want to like change the world. And it's not the Marxist or scientific socialist way. It is about discerning the contradictions in the world itself that are giving rise to a completely new mode of production. So someone who's in the unhappy consciousness looks at capitalism and says, I am dissatisfied with capitalism for some moral or ideological or principled reason, and I want a different society, and I want a different mode of production, right? Well, that's still utopian. That's the unhappy consciousness described by Hegel, right? That's going to get you to this subjective position of false superiority over the world. I know it all and the world is wrong, and it's just a matter of me changing the world into something that's right. Nope, that's unscientific, utopian, and also adolescent. The Marxist way is to say that this contradiction is not a contradiction between my subjective consciousness and the world. It's a contradiction proper to the thing itself. That's dialectics. It's a contradiction in the world itself, within the world itself. So that whatever contradiction I perceive that I have with capitalism is a contradiction within capitalism itself, okay? So it's also about eliminating this voluntaristic idea of, oh, we need to impose socialism. No, socialism already won. The implications subjectively of we already live in socialism are very fucking simple. It's not, okay, so we have nothing left to do. It's we need to awaken to that fact. And that's going to traverse the entirety of society, the state, consciousness, culture, and everything. Just awakening to that simple fact is an acute condemnation of the existing society, so far as we can conceive it as something that can be challenged within the sphere of our practical intervention. Condemns the whole thing, condemns all of society. It's almost like these people are the medieval, I'm not going to say the whole Catholic Church, because, I know there is this debate and Catholics are right and whatever, Protestants are right, but just within the specific context of the corrupt Catholic Church that Luther was dealing with at the time, it's almost like what I'm saying is more like the Protestant predestination type of thing. Whereas I feel like these people represent the corrupted Catholic Church, where they're just kind of like trying to say, oh, you can kind of like buy your way into salvation, into socialism by doing the right praxis, and will make socialism. It's extremely corrupt, gives rise to like this indulgent selling of, all the fucking attention economy and cloud economy on using your marginalized identity and using your suffering and using your praxis to get social capital and all that fucking bullshit. Whereas I'm kind of like the predestination thing where I'm like, okay, it already fucking happened. You're going to hell or you're going to heaven already, right? It's already fucking happening, right? When people say, does that mean we do nothing? That's the same thing as when people reproach the Protestants with like, okay, if it's already predestined, why make any choices at all? Why even try and be a good person? Because you don't know. Because you don't know what the predestination is. You don't know what socialism looks like. You don't know what the consciousness of socialism is. You don't know what the culture of socialism is going to be. You don't know what the politics of socialism is going to be. All of that is open. You don't know any of that. You have to discover that.
Base.
Another reason synthetic lefties get so triggered by socialism is they think it's like a conservative claiming the USA is run by socialists.
Yeah, thank you, Morlock. That's some of the reason I like it, though, because it's like, it's true. When conservatives say that, they're right. And I want to get into the point about this. When conservatives say that we're ruled by a bunch of communists and we're ruled by a bunch of socialists, they're pretty much right. But the problem with those conservatives is that, I can't wait to be quoted out of context for this. They're not against them enough. They're not against the people who rule us enough. You know who's really against the communists who rule us? Or the socialists that rule us? Other communists. China. Now let me explain the background and the context of that. Because there's so many prongs to this thing about like we already live in socialism that I want to get to. Before I even get to like the analysis of like why materially, which this person tries to allude to in their thread, I need people to understand that the Sino-Soviet split was not just some like, oh, that was just some dumb skirmish over nothing. No, the Sino-Soviet split was the principal contradiction, the principal antagonism. It is the most advanced antagonism in the history of the world. It is the culmination of world history. The Sino-Soviet split was the culmination of the Weltgeist, culmination of world history, and the absolute concrete contradiction defining the era. Now, what's significant specifically about the Sino-Soviet split is the following scandal: that after the triumph of the socialist mode of production, from the transition from a capitalist mode of production to a socialist mode of production, there remains some kind of class antagonism. I need people to understand some context behind the Cultural Revolution, which was an extension of the Sino-Soviet split and an extension of this communist civil war where Mao was waging a war against the managerial class of world communism, including within China. When they were talking about in China, the capitalist roaders, they weren't actually talking about economic policy, because the Cultural Revolution did not affect economic policy by and large. The increasing decentralization and freeing up of markets after the Great Leap Forward continued throughout all of the years of the Cultural Revolution. It did not affect the actual changes at hand. There's a very smooth continuity between the Chinese economy after the Great Leap Forward into Deng Xiaoping's reforms after the Cultural Revolution. A very smooth continuity. When they were warning of the threat of capitalist roaders, they were not talking about anything relating to economic policy, because the economic policy was this kind of apparent capitalism. It wasn't capitalism, but it looked awfully similar to. There was increasing market exchange, and there was an increased level of decentralization and an increased level of like apparently private accumulation. It wasn't really private at all. Nothing was changed economically during the course of the Cultural Revolution. What they really meant by the capitalist roaders during the Cultural Revolution was not Deng Xiaoping's reforms. It was this fear that these economic changes that were happening already since the Great Leap Forward would give rise to the prevalence of a capitalist and bourgeois consciousness and basically destroy the party and basically destroy communism and destroy whatever, the proletarian ideology. So the Cultural Revolution is called a cultural revolution because they viewed culture as the decisive site of what was at stake. We have to preserve proletarian consciousness because it seems like the economic base is changing in such a way that makes it easy for kind of capitalist roaders and bourgeois consciousness to prevail. And that's actually what happened in the ex-communist states, like in Eastern Europe and the USSR. I mean, it's literally what happened. You know, what happened was the restoration of an apparent liberal, whatever, bourgeois capitalism, right? So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because you have this crisis of consciousness in being able to understand what the objectivity of a socialist mode of production is. The Cultural Revolution was really decisive in bringing that out. What is the objectivity of a socialist mode of production? Is socialism reducible to some ideological project or some political project? Or is there an actual objective reality of a socialist mode of production? So that's what you're dealing with. And the decisive significance with the Sino-Soviet split is basically this: even if the socialist mode of production prevails, why is there this lingering threat of capitalist or bourgeois consciousness? Moreover, why does there remain what appears to be some kind of class antagonism? What did Mao, and then Mao's last campaign before he died, this is some esoteric shit, was basically the question: what does it mean for the dictatorship over the bourgeoisie to exist under socialism? Because the bourgeoisie as a class appears to have been eliminated physically. So why is there this bourgeoisie? Where is the fucking bourgeoisie? It's like the basic question, the enigma of the Cultural Revolution. Because a lot of people are confused about the Cultural Revolution. It's a great proletarian Cultural Revolution, but where's the bourgeoisie? There's no fucking bourgeoisie. It's clear. Now, Mao said something pretty heretical, pretty devastating, and I think it sums up a lot of the contradictions of contemporary socialism. Mao said, and it takes a lot of hermeneutics to be able to understand this, but he said something pretty shocking. He said, the bourgeoisie is in the Communist Party. That's what Mao said. He said the bourgeoisie is in the Communist Party. Now, my hermeneutic for interpreting what Mao meant by that is more or less that the class antagonism has become internalized, and that socialism, while acquiring an objective reality, has not eliminated the class antagonism that is internal to the party. The socialist mode of production always gives rise to the possibility of capitalist restoration through the forgetting of the original essence of the party. And it is within the party itself that the decisive significance of subjectively and superstructurally articulating the objectivity of socialism, that's where it becomes decisive. And if the party does not correctly articulate this objective and material socialist mode of production that it itself has ruled over politically, there will arise some kind of new bourgeoisie, some kind of new capitalist class, similar to the parasitical financial capitalist class that prevails in America today, which is purely institutionally safeguarded and stuff. So Mao wasn't strictly saying that the bourgeoisie exists within the party, but that the potential for the bourgeoisie is in the party. That's how I interpret it. Which means the party always has to safeguard and be vigilant against the possibility of the reemergence of the bourgeoisie. And that this is something that is internal to the party itself. It's not between the party and some external enemy. It's all internal to the party itself. That has some shocking implications. So when I say we already live in socialism, this does not in any way downplay the significance of the necessity of the rule of a communist party. On the contrary, it increases it manifold, right? It's like only a communist party can articulate the fact that we already live in socialism. And by the way, us already living in socialism, you have to understand what a mode of production is. It doesn't mean the corporations that rule us and the banks and the institutions that rule us. That's the socialist mode of production. The socialist mode of production refers to deeper relations of production that are not only not given representation by the state superstructure, but also by the economic superstructure in the form of the monopolist institutions and corporations, etc., etc., etc. So that's why it's not always accurate to say, oh, we live in socialism. It's true on a fundamental level, but there's also a sense in which we still live in capitalism because the economic superstructure in the form of the economic institutions that are still in power are vestiges of the capitalist era. So I'm not saying communists will come in power and, inherit the corporate economy or some shit and just give it a communist flavor. No, all of that is going to be annihilated. Principally, through the destruction of intellectual property laws. Disney's going to be destroyed. Pepsi and Coke will be destroyed. All of America's brands will suffer greatly. The pure means of production will be unleashed. The implication is that all this stuff, our phenomena which demonstrate our socialist mode of production, that, look, if you don't like this word, you at least have to admit we're not living in the capitalist mode of production that Marx described. Now, I'm saying that these events, the more or less triumph of the socialist mode of production, price gouging, inflation, and the falling of real and relative wages refer to the incompetency of the superstructure to adjust to that fact. But it's not like these represent some socialist system. These are symptoms of a dying system that has been fundamentally outmoded. So that's the more accurate way of saying it. Now they're saying Haas is the heir to Kautsky. Let's see what this is. Here we have what is most essential to theoretical appraisal of the latest phase of capitalism, imperialism. Namely that capitalism becomes monopoly capitalism. The erroneous bourgeois reformist assertion that monopoly capitalism or state monopoly capitalism is no longer capitalism but can now be called state socialism is very common. The trusts, of course, never provided and do not provide and cannot provide complete planning. But however they do plan, however they do calculate in advance the volume of production on a national, even international scale, however much they systematically regulate it, that's the socialization. We still remain under capitalism at its new stage. It is true, but still capitalism, without a doubt. The proximity of such capitalism to socialism serves as a genuine representative of the proletariat, the urgency of the socialist revolution, not an all for an argument for tolerating the repudiation of such a revolution and the efforts to make capitalism look more attractive, something which all reformers are trying to do. Okay. Of course, Lenin was right. It's just there's one slight problem. This was written 100 years ago. A lot has happened since then. Okay? Now, when Marx wrote Volume 3 of Capital and Lenin wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage, how many years was that? Let's say it was like 1880, so 20. That was 40 years. So it's been 100 years since Lenin wrote Imperialism. And it was 40 years after Marx's death that Lenin wrote Imperialism, an entirely new stage of capitalism. Lenin called imperialism the last stage. So do you think that this stage of capitalism has lasted another 100 years and nothing new changed? It's just imperialism. Sorry, no. The fact is that we don't define the death of the capitalist mode of production in terms of the increased socialization of capitalism. That is the quality of imperialism, which Lenin acknowledged was a step closer to socialism. but it's a quality of imperialism. What principally defines the end of the capitalist mode of production is the breakdown of the commodity form, and not only in the form of the gold standard, also in the form of the derivative nature of private property. The fact that there isn't really any more private ownership of the means of production. There are exclusive rights to lease forces of production in a certain way, in a contract with the state or in a contract with some bigger force, but it's increasingly derivative is the point. It's derivative from the underlying like socialistic ownership. This is explicitly how it is in China, by the way. You don't really have the right to own anything. You more have the right to have exclusive rights to the use and the exclusive rights to the brand through intellectual property or through contracts with the government, exclusive contracts to do this or to do that. So that's another aspect, the increasingly derivative nature of capitalism. It also has to do with the fact that profit has become a measurement rather than an ends of production, with the largest, most advanced enterprises or companies, whatever you want to call them, corporations, operating primarily at a loss. Profit is just a measurement of how successful they've been, not the actual ends of production. No matter how fantastical these ends are, by the way, Elon Musk, he's telling people he's going to go to Mars, or Jeff Bezos said he's going to do this, or Bill. It can be a fantastical utopia. It doesn't matter. It's not. You can't explain the ultimate ends of production purely in the terms of squeezing out profit. You also have the way in which the state intervenes into the economy as a matter of national security in order to like prevent civil unrest or social unrest, basically rig the economy that's going to satisfy more or less a basic standard of living. Yeah, the remnants of capitalist property are upheld politically and legally now. They don't subsist in the sphere of civil society itself. You could also talk about how this new significance of data in the economy clearly attests to the fact that the measurement of social needs, socially defined wants, I guess you could put them, ways of life, is a primary force of production now. There's all sorts of ways you can look at it. I think the underlying thing, though, that I would use to explain the transition is mostly about property. It's mostly about the change in property relations, not necessarily just the fact that the gold standard was more or less abandoned. It wasn't just the fact of the 1929 crash. It's more about the breakdown of the universal commodity form. The universal commodity form is basically broken down, and it's increasingly maintained purely in the form of geopolitics. And the commodity form it wasn't abolished, as they tried to strawman me into saying. It was just sublated in a new way. It changed. It's preserved earlier aspects, but also has become subsumed into an entirely and more superior form. I think 1929 was the breaking point, definitely. That was the abrupt change, was 1929. Another indication also to think about of why the notion that, oh, it's just imperialism is problematic is one of the ways Lenin defined imperialism was when it's about the net export no longer of commodities, but of capital, right? The thing is that after World War II, with the Bretton Woods system that was created, the US became a net importer of capital. And that the Bretton Woods scheme was specifically designed to help develop the world's economies in a way that rivaled the communist bloc's developmental schemes and regimes. So developmentalism, while you could say that there's something like that existed in Japan or Germany before 1929 and before the Bretton Woods system, I think the Bretton Woods system, with the specific way that it recycled the surpluses of production coming from the US around the world, I think that qualitatively differs as a system from imperialism. I mean, for the purposes of development. I think it's a global system the US created to rival the communist bloc. But I mean, I pointed this out earlier, which is that socialism doesn't really become decisive at the level of the state as much as it becomes decisive at the level of civil society. So, for example, when the state is just owning everything and whatever, that isn't where the socialist mode of production becomes objective. For example, under the USSR's state ownership during the 20s and war communism, that's still a capitalist mode of production. It's just the state seizing everything still within a underlying capitalist relations of production. A socialist mode of production only becomes objective when there's a change in civil society. So, for example, with the establishment of the kolkhozes, which were not state property, mind you, They were not state property within the USSR. There you can see the objectivity of socialism and the emergence of a socialist mode of production within the USSR. Socialism is not when the state owns everything. It's when within civil society itself, some kind of social ends become the primary ends of the production process. All social relations are organized spontaneously, right, from civil society itself, not in a way that's enforced politically or ideologically, but from the very bonds defining civil society, production has as its ends some kind of social ends. That's where socialism becomes decisive. That's why socialism with Chinese characteristics is a more mature form of socialism than the socialism that existed in China's 20th century. That was a political system of control over the economy. Socialist relations of production were not actually able to develop like they have in China now. China has socialist relations of production now. The socialist relations of production within China can be principally defined, let me phrase this the right way, by the relation to production principally being defined not by the ownership of private property, but by profession, skill, rank, the administrative and managerial position, etc., 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 by a relation to production that is defined in terms of use value, right? Not primarily exchange. I think this is how I would define socialist relations of production. For example, the various companies within China that exist, which I guess delimit some form of private property. There's separate enterprises and separate companies. They ruthlessly compete with one another. But what relations define them? I would say their relations are defined by one of determinate exchange, right? That's what I wanted to say. Socialist relations of production can be defined by determinate exchange. So in capitalist relations of production, exchange is indeterminate. One commodity for money, it's indifferent to the ultimate ends, right? When socialist relations of production, there is an exchange that goes on, but the exchange is placed within the context of determinate ends established by the state or even by the company or whatever, right? So I think that's how I would define it, the determinate exchange. Instead of the general commodity production of capitalism, you have a determinate commodity production of socialism. That's what I would say. Thank you, Benan.
Would you say US dollar hegemony is a remnant of abstract universality in exchange?
Let me explain to you why multipolarity is of such importance to us for socialism, for an understanding of the socialist mode of production. It's inherently multipolar. Now, the triumph of the socialist mode of production takes the form of multipolarity. Why? Because, benign, it's a good example. Yes and no. US dollar hegemony artificially establishes the abstract universality of general commodity production through the very form of a socialist mode of production. It's just that it doesn't seem like it's a socialist mode of production. It seems like it's the normal, free capitalist world market when it's a very specific Fabian, whatever, Anglo-American bourgeois socialist project of global unipolarity, right? Only when we find other polarities, a Chinese polarity, a Russian polarity, does it become clear that a system that appears to be universal is actually particular and determinate. And it is in that sense that we say we live in socialism. One of the reasons I say we already live in socialism is to deny the universality of the American unipolar system. It's a determinate system. It's a particular system. So that's a very good question, actually. Very good question. It's a good example of how the capitalist mode of production has changed into something else. Kautsky would be like a DSA person who's like, oh, we already live in socialism, so we can just preserve the system. But here's the thing. How can you have reforms if we already live in socialism? That's what I'm trying to say. How can we have reforms if we already live in socialism? You can't have reforms. You can't have a peaceful evolution or whatever Kautsky's saying. How could you? How reform for what? What are you exactly reforming for? That's what I'm trying to say. That's why I'm against the socialists more than anyone. I'm against AOC, the Squad, and the progressives more than I'm against the Republican Party. I'm a Ron Paul Maoist libertarian. I want to break the whole system. You think I'm for reformism like AOC? No. I see the socialist reformers as people who want to consolidate the rotten superstructure we have today by beautifying it. The current superstructure is fundamentally incompatible with the underlying mode of production that has emerged and the relations of production that have emerged. Monopolies are old news, okay? Monopolies are completely old news. but the degree of derivative financial abstraction that is driving these monopolies, that underpins these monopolies, that is where there's a step further from imperialism. It's not just a quantitative increase of complexity and abstraction, it's the way in which surpluses of production are channeled to develop entire countries. Okay, so that's like a very different thing. And then after 73, you have what Varoufakis calls the global minotaur, which is basically then the way in which the surpluses of the production of other countries are used on Wall Street, vacuum cleaned back. So all the investment that goes into these countries comes back to us into Wall Street. And it creates this developmental regime, which has fundamentally uprooted the capitalist relations of production. Still the rule of a Wall Street parasitical class, but the capitalist relations of production, so far as they have roots in civil society, have been uprooted completely. It's just a completely institutionalized political reality now.